A Song of Ice and Fire has a rich and storied history of not being able to fit into as many books as the author thinks it's going to fit into. This series was initially envisioned as a trilogy, then it blew into 4 books, then 5, then 6, and now we are looking at a future where Martin has outlined 7 potential Song of Ice and Fire novels, the 5 that have currently been published, plus The Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring. Martin has continually discussed the idea of splitting The Winds of Winter. He's never definitively said, no, I am not and will never do this, but rather he said he's resisting that notion, that publishers maybe have suggested it or floated the idea, but he really hasn't gone for it, as he doesn't want to have more books than this series already has. As I said, it's already over doubled in length. This is a notion that I think is starting to become more appealing, and today I'm going to make my case as to why I think it is finally time to split The Winds of Winter into 2 distinct volumes. Let's look back quickly at the history of splitting books in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. Martin has said on a Game of Owns interview that when he was writing A Game of Thrones, he found that it really wasn't going to be enough page space to do everything he wanted to do in that book. So Clash of Kings was born. A Game of Thrones remained its own kind of self-contained story, ends with the death of Ned Stark and the events that follow there, and Daenerys on the pyre, and then A Clash of Kings was meant to continue and complete that story and the original vision that Martin had intended. A Storm of Swords is the only volume in the entire series that was written and published and intended to be just that one volume. A Game of Thrones was supposed to be one volume and contain Clash's material, but that ended up in a different book. And as I'm sure you well know, A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons take place over roughly the same chronological period, but they are split. Some characters appear in one book, some appear in the other, some appear in both. It varies. So overall, the series has a pretty diverse history of how books are split, when books are split, and it's happened to literally every book so far except A Storm of Swords, which, I mean, only took 2 years to write, and I'm still in awe and unsure how Martin did that. What do you all think? Do you think The Winds of Winter should be split? I'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. We'd really appreciate it, and it really helps me grow the channel. So we need to look at the methods that Martin could use to split The Winds of Winter. I think there are 3, and I think one of them is off the table right now. The first is simply clefting the book in twain, but that requires a completed book, which we, as far as we know, don't currently have. The other 2 methods have been employed in this series before, and I'm going to look at each of them and their pros and their cons. The first is the more recent method, the splitting by character method. So we saw like no Tyrion in Feast for Crows and no Sansa in A Dance with Dragons. That could essentially happen with The Winds of Winter. They're around 20 viewpoints. Just take 10, stick it in The Winds of Winter Part 1, take the other 10, take it into A Time for Wolves. The other is just splitting chronologically. This is what happened with A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. We reached the end of A Game of Thrones, and there aren't any characters that are excluded from A Clash of Kings. It's just more of these characters as they go along. This does have its own hurdles, and we're going to dive into each of those and what I think would be the better method. Let's start off with splitting my character. This is the more quote-unquote recent development, if by recent you mean 2005, and it does have some advantages to taking this method. Most notably that it is the method that he is currently the most familiar with. It's what he did most recently, and also matches how he writes. Martin doesn't write chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Instead, he writes by character arc and just when he has ideas. He might write like 50, not 50, he might write 10 Cersei chapters in a row, and not have chapters 2, 3, and 4 done, even if Cersei's chapter 1. We know that Tyrion's story is done in The Winds of Winter, but we don't know exactly how many chapters that is. We don't know where those chapters fall in the book. So if we are splitting by character, it would more naturally follow his writing style, insofar as he could just take the characters that he has done and plop them all into this first tome of The Winds of Winter and leave the uncompleted ones for A Time for Wolves, as we'll call it. With that said, this style has some notable disadvantages, some of which have occurred in the series already, some of which haven't and would be new problems for The Winds of Winter. First and foremost, we saw him split Feast and Dance like this, and we saw that it took him a lot longer to finish Dance than it did, comparably, A Clash of Kings. That said, he was younger when he was writing The Clash of Kings, and it was it seemed to be more on a roll, and he does get on rolls, as he says. But we do see that leaving the unfinished characters for later does oftentimes result in just kind of further spiraling and world building and what have you. Additionally, there's another problem that really kind of started to happen in Dance with Dragons, but really didn't reach the fore yet. The Meereenese Knot was a problem that Martin often discussed during writing, this being the reconvening of viewpoint characters at Meereen. I think that splitting a book in two when you already have these characters tied into knots is going to be very difficult and not great overall. Specifically, if you are splitting by character, it could lead to some really redundant chapters in the second volume. I mean, we have the one repeated John chapter in A Feast for Crows and A Dance with Dragons, with it having Sam's perspective and John's perspective, and that is cool in that one instance. But I think that if we are having, like, say, Tyrion is in the first volume, but then Victarion, who is traveling with him, is in the second one, it would either create a lot fewer Victarion chapters or erase a bunch that Martin has already done, or it just overall would seem strangely redundant and might leave gaps in the story that might not otherwise be there. Overall, I don't think splitting by character is the way to go with splitting the Winds of Winter. This leaves splitting chronologically as the method that I think would be best for the Winds of Winter, and it still has its drawbacks. I just still think it's better than splitting by character in this specific instance, with characters reconvening. Specifically, I think that this allows him for more time to think about later events, and we saw the way that sort of developed certain plot lines in Clash of Kings to the extent that they might not have been there in the original vision of A Game of Thrones. Specifically, Stannis' plot seems to be a great new contrivance that Martin came up with in the time between, and if there is potential for more good stuff like that in a potentially chronologically split book, I would be quite excited for it. Additionally, it allows for some story progression and for some consistency between characters. We would still have the 20 viewpoints we have in A Dance with Dragons and A Feast for Crows, and we'd likely get to see all of them, but it just wouldn't go as far. There's a question of how much ground would the first half of this book cover. It does seem like it would probably be a decent amount given the battles that are going to occur, and that could be a good reason in and of itself to split this book chronologically, just to get done this climax to Dance with Dragons that wasn't done when the book was initially released. And overall, I think that those are some pros for a chronological, but I do think there are some drawbacks, and it's an interesting balancing act there. The main drawback with Chronological is that Martin writes by character, as I previously mentioned, not by chapter order. We know he doesn't have some material finish, and theoretically, all of that unfinished material, all of those unfinished chapters, could be in the first half of the book. This is almost definitely not the case, but he definitely couldn't just split it and have it out tomorrow if he did it chronologically. Also, cutting a book almost directly in half would make it pretty difficult for characters to have compelling arcs within a single novel, as he'd very likely need to restructure some developments, plot points, and just character progression. Instead of just having a drawn out over an entire book, he'd have to pretty much cut it in half and either decide, oh, this character's arc is going to get done a lot sooner and they're going to be more developed for the next book, or we're going to leave an arc in progress, or we're just going to change it entirely. It would require some pretty extensive thinking on his part. With that said, I do think chronological is the way to split wins. I think that character has some very big flaws, most notably making certain chapters in the second part redundant, and I think that chronological would very much solve that, and I think it would be some work. He would have some material he'd still need to finish, he'd have some character arcs he'd need to reconsider, but we'd be looking at maybe around a year or so of work as opposed to indefinitely waiting for a tome that is way too big to fit into one single volume anyway. I should also note, I was not always in favor of splitting the Winds of Winter. I was actually pretty opposed to it for the same reasons as Martin, not wanting the series to balloon past 7 books, but I do think over the last year or so, it has kind of slowly been growing on me as a way to continue the series for a number of reasons. I think there are a few very good reasons as to why now is the time to split the Winds of Winter. First and foremost is honestly for Martin's own sake. He's had a really tough couple of years for a number of reasons, most notably the deaths of several friends. I can't imagine how much harder it is to see almost all discussion of you and your work online consumed with bitterness about an unreleased book. His blog has been just kind of very depressing lately, and it's understandable, and I hope he feels better, but I do think that releasing something could end up tiding fans over and give the author a win at the time when he needs it the most. Imagine how happy a book tour for this half of wins would be, as opposed to the constant whining and complaining from fans about this book not being over. I know he's expressed in the past that, oh, as soon as I release the next book, people ask, where is A Dream of Spring? But I think to an extent that's true. There are some people who are just going to be kind of pricks forever, but I do think that it would inject some positivity in both the lives of the fans and maybe even his own life. In addition to getting the fans off Martin's back, it would definitely get his publisher and maybe even HBO off of there as well. We know that he inked a pretty massive deal with HBO in I think, March of 2021, involving the development of several spin-off shows, which we now know have been taking up a lot of his time. If he were to be able to release something that could free up his focus a little more to do the things it seems like he truly wants to do, while further securing his legacy, which is something that seems like is a growing concern for him. Additionally, I think that overall it is important to think about the publisher angle of this. We did see their influence in the publication of A Dance with Dragons, as that publication was announced before A Dance with Dragons was even completed. So overall, we do know they have some sway. It just is unclear how much they have, and given the fact that we haven't gotten a book in 13 years outside of Fire and Blood, I would guess that Martin is kind of dug in at this point, but I don't know. It would just make everybody, I think, better off. There's another important element to think about here, the fact that no matter what happens, even if The Winds of Winter is fully completed and set as one book as Martin intends it, it still seems less likely that he'll actually be able to finish the series in just one more book. In that original outline that was supposed to be a trilogy, there weren't nearly this many characters. So many people who are now vital to the story just didn't exist. And we can see that the number of viewpoints doubles between A Storm of Swords and A Feast for Crows / It Ends with Dragons, and we need to include chapters from all of these characters, even if they're just getting killed off in certain instances. With that said, I don't think many characters are going to get killed off in The Winds of Winter, at least in the way of viewpoints. I think Barristan, I think Aeron, I think Aereo maybe, but other than that, I assume most of our main players will stick around and need to have chapters. The Winds of Winter is going to be an impossibly big book regardless, so I feel like splitting it, cutting it down, cutting the workload down, and allowing time for later plotlines to develop could also be an additional benefit to this. Another commonly cited downside for splitting the text further is the argument that it'll take even longer. I think the past 13-year wait spells out the opposite fact pretty directly. We're waiting already. I think waiting in slightly shorter, which is an incredibly low bar, increments would be a ton healthier for fans and author alike. I grew up a fan of comics and reading them every month, most notably The Walking Dead. Having a new issue at my local comic shop every month was such a fun experience, almost being a perfect blend of the gap of space between TV episodes and the space between book releases. Martin obviously can't do that, but I think it speaks towards the better kind of relationship with the text that a shorter gap can create. I think the way to do that might be to release in shorter bursts rather than saving things up for what is looking like maybe a 1,700 page tome, which is just insane and massive. I'm not saying Martin should release a chapter on his blog every week, but I do think that maybe looking into splitting the book and making it into smaller iterations could be a way forward that just makes everybody happy, including the author himself. I genuinely think that splitting the Winds of Winter is in the best interest of all parties involved. Martin would finally get to see some positivity around his work and be able to share some of his vision for the series and how it should have truly ended as compared to the show. Fans will be sated, hopefully for more than just a little while, as we really haven't had anything new in 13 years, and I'm sure would just be grateful for anything, even if it means waiting a little longer for the next one, though I do think that the waiting period would be decreased, given that he would have a lot of material left over from this one. With that said, if I had to guess, it would still probably take around 6 years to get another book after a split half of The Winds of Winter. But, I mean, it's looking like it might take that long for the whole of The Winds of Winter anyway. So if we could get half while we wait, if it creates a little bit of restructuring, that would make sense. But overall, I think it would be good for everybody. I think it would be just nice. I hope it happens, and not just because I love this series. That said, I would trust Martin's vision for the series completely. If he wants to keep it as one book, I understand that that is the best decision. If he does want to split it, I understand that he thinks that is the best decision. Overall, I just want A, to see this series continue, and B, for the author to be happy in a time that he has really not been very happy. Thank you all so much for watching. Thank you for watching, George Martin, and I'm sure you'll take this under advisement. But I hope you enjoyed the video. I really appreciate any support, any likes, comments, subscribes, all the typical YouTube stuff. It does really help grow the channel, and yeah, I appreciate all of it. I'll have much more on A Song of Ice and Fire in the near future, a few cool ideas that I'm excited to begin working on, but I did have this one recently with some of Martin's Naughtablogs that I think it just could be for everyone's benefit, and I wanted to lay out at least what I think is the history and the case for splitting the book, which I think maybe is more likely than people think. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a good day. Bye!